Okay, does everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Then we will start. So hello, everybody. I'm Kim Zanino. I am the Vice President of the Lowell Historical Society. And today we are doing a virtual tour of Edson Cemetery. So we are going to do what would have been a walking tour online. So we're going to start right now. So the city of Lowell has several cemeteries. We're covering Edson here today, but in Lowell cemeteries, there's from a municipal, there's 3 active, which is Edson is 1 because Edson's still active. West Lawn 1 and 2. There's 3 inactive, which are older cemeteries. So that's Pawtucket, School Street, and Old English. We have several private, including the Lowell Cemetery and the Butler Ames Cemetery, which is actually also known as the Hildreth family. St. Patrick's, Woodbine, St. Joseph's, Holy Trinity. We have 2 maintained by the town of Dracut, which is interesting. We have the Hildreth Cemetery and Hamlet. And then we have 2 that a status is abandoned. That's the Hunt Clark Cemetery and the Clay Pit. So today we're going to talk about Edson. But in order to do that, I do have to talk about some of the older cemeteries first, just to explain how Edson came about. So these 2 cemeteries here, one is the Mammoth Road Cemetery and the other is the School Street Cemetery. So if you were in the city of Lowell in the 1830s and the early times, you had several choices. If you had a family lot in one of these cemeteries, you could be buried there. Otherwise, you could go outside. If you needed consecrated ground, you would have to find it. So this is a very interesting, so this really just had these smaller cemeteries here. Also was the Old English Cemetery, which was mostly English workers that worked in the mills. Mammoth Road was a family one to start. The School Street was a neighborhood one, started in 1810. But if you look at them, they're pretty much the same. It's a lot of slate stones. They're all facing east. And the reason for that is they firmly believed, if you look at the Mammoth Road, you can even see a footstone. If you were going to rise for the Day of Judgment, you had to rise to be facing a certain way and to be rise and face. Most of the time you didn't want to walk on the grave, but in the Mammoth Road Cemetery, because of the way it was facing, it's inevitable. You have to, if you're looking at the stone, you're standing on them. But anyway, these are the older cemeteries. So this were the choices that you had if you wanted to be buried in the city of Lowell. At first, the town of Lowell, then the city of Lowell. Really, there was a big change from the puritanical thoughts of death. Memento mori, remember your mortality. So when you look at the stones from 1717, there's a little bit, there's not skull and crossbones. Now the skulls have wings. It's a winged effigy. So this one dates to the 1717 in the Hunt Clark Cemetery. So that's kind of coming from the idea that, you know, everyone's going to die. It's very puritanical. I guess it's called puritanical pessimism. With skulls and bones to these winged effigies. And I have one here that's an intermittent, if you can see it. It's actually a cherub with wings. This is from a cemetery, it's a casting from a cemetery in Boston. So that came about, more portraits, more cherubs with wings. And then eventually it started getting more to a different way of looking at death as hope and immortality. And when it started with, if you see the slate with the urn and the willow, looking at classical civilizations such as Egypt and Greece, urns and willows, urns were, of course, were from Greece, but the willows were a symbol of Persephone and the underworld. So that's another bringing into some classicism. These slate stones, oftentimes, there's a little bit difference between them. One was rougher. These are a little more stylized. The one on the right, this is actually in Edson Cemetery. It predates Edson Cemetery, so it was moved there by a family member. So this is Charles H., son of MJ and Mary Smart, died August 23rd, 1839 at age 21 months. And underneath would be an epitaph, a verse of some sort. And then underneath that, usually this one's signed by B. Day Lowell, meaning Benjamin Day and Lowell. It's kind of a calling card. And we can see that that's how they advertise. So if you like the stone, you would know where to go and get one. But this is how the ideas of death kind of morphed on gravestone imagery. And it also morphed on the landscapes because Pierre Lachaise in Paris started with the first rural cemetery movement. And then, of course, it came to America in 1831 with Mount Auburn Cemetery. This is a gorgeous cemetery. It's unlike any ones that really had come before. A lot of classical columns or Egyptian revival architecture or beautiful vistas and landscapes. The stones weren't all lined up facing the same way. They were all on paths and the rolling slopes. Much different thought about how death was occurring and to remember the individual. And if on the right, if you see the Boot Mausoleum, that is an Auburn cemetery, and that is actually where Kirk Boot is buried. He has a Egyptian revival tomb. So if you knew he died in 1837, if you were, a class person and you could afford it, you would go down and be buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Well, that led to other places looking for this type of new landscape. So Lowell Cemetery came about. Some wealthy mill owners and other prominent businessmen, they were looking for a place like that. So they decided to do one in Lowell. So Lowell Cemetery came about in 1841. That's the Air Lion, he's famous. Very interesting that it was the only green space. There weren't any public parks until 1845 when they did the Commons. So Lowell Cemetery served the purpose of being a green space, and it often got pretty crowded. One person who did not attend the dedication, and his absent, well, I can't say it was missed by some of those people, but it was Reverend Theodore Edson. He did not attend it because he did not feel that this was, he really wanted a place for the people of Lowell, and that wasn't it. It was too expensive for most people, especially workers. So Reverend Theodore Edson, the founder of Edson Cemetery, this quote here from Charles Crowley in the Illustrated History of Lowell is probably one of the best quotes about Theodore Edson. It's, Reverend Mr. Edson was deeply interested in all that concerned the welfare of his adopted town. If Kirk Boot and the others thought they were getting a yes man when they had Theodore Edson, Reverend Theodore Edson, come and be the pastor of the Reverend of St. Anne's Church, they were wrong. He felt for the people and the workers, and he would address any kind of what he felt wasn't fair for them. He had an orphanage. He was the father of schools. He really was deeply interested in helping his community. So in 1846, Lowell City Council agreed, and it became City Cemetery number 3. City Cemetery number 1 was the School Street Cemetery. City Cemetery number 2 was Old English. This was City Cemetery number 3. It was not known as Edson Cemetery until 1878. So here you can see the original 30 acres, and then later on they added on. So I think now it's about 46 acres with 10,000 lot owners. So you can kind of see the difference. Looking at the landscape, much different. Here's Edson Cemetery. It was a flat terrain. It was in a grid-like pattern. It was to have the most sellable lots. That was the point, is to make it as economical as possible. So here we have Washington Ave, that's the chapel. We have Lincoln, we have Garfield, we have Custer and Logan, and then First Ave, Second Ave, and so on. It was very simply put together. If you look over here toward Spencer Street, that big yard was the first yard, and that was the yard that most of the burials had started in. So here we are at the gates of Edson Cemetery. Now, the gates were done by the Gum Brothers. The Gum Brothers were popular. Hear their name a lot during this presentation because they were, in fact, very prominent, and they were right there on Gorham at Maple Street. So these were the gates as you enter off Gorham Street. This is here. And as I said, the Gum Brothers, Granite Works. So this was Lewis Gum, one of the brothers. He was, his yard was on Gorham Street, corner of Maple. So the Gum Brothers did a lot of granite work and marble, any stone really. So the first monument I want to talk about is the Arnold Monument. And I have to say, of all the years of taking pictures, I've never gotten a good picture of the Arnold Monument, which is sad. Commodore William A. Arnold was with the GAR, which is Grand Army of the Republic, designed this memorial in 1918 for himself and his late wife, who had passed away. And he said he had spent 20 years designing this. If you look at it, there is 13 stars for the original 13 colonies. It says one country and one flag, the dates of the war, and eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, I believe it says. And down the bottom, inside, it says, under the broad canopy of our creator across the bottom. So very interesting stone. The GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, was founded in 1866, open to anybody who was honorably discharged, veteran of the War of the Rebellion between 1861 and 1865. The very last member of GAR died in 1956 at 109 years old. So of course, once the last person died, the organization stopped. Now, right across from that, this is on 3rd Ave near Oberlin, is the Sawyer Monument. This is quite beautiful. It was commissioned by Dr. Wesley Sawyer for his wife that had passed away. Pinardi, John M. Pinardi is the name of the sculptor. And he was pretty interesting because he did own Lowell Monument Company, and he started that in 1913. So this is probably, if this was done in 1915, this is probably one of his first really big commissions that he did after he started the Lowell Monument Company. So Dr. Sawyer had asked Pinardi to do this. Pinardi had an interesting past where he was an apprentice in granite and marble cutting in Quincy, Mass, where a lot of the granite had come, a lot of the stone had come from. He worked in his father's sculpting studio. So he had stone cutting background, he had sculpting background. And he actually worked for the Gum Brothers when he first came to Lowell. So there's the Gum Brothers again. Now, the subject matter is interesting. It took me a while, but I finally did narrow down where the subject matter came from. If you had recognized it, it's from a hymn called Rock of Ages from 1763. It was written by Reverend A. Toplady. And it's nothing in my hand I bring, simply to the cross I cling. So actually, you may see this in other cemeteries because it was a common hymn. Passaconaway. This was, he has gone through several iterations. He's lost his tomahawk several times. He's lost his spear several times. He's lost his headdress several times. But he has been repaired over and over again, and he's actually due for another repair now. The picture, the black and white picture, is actually from the Boston Public Library, has a set of these older pictures. So I knew about the plaque on the front that says Chief of the Pennacooks. And it says on the bottom, property of the Improved Order of Redmen of Massachusetts. So this was the Order of the Redmen lot. And under his foot, there's another one that says erected by the Passaconaway tribe, number 32, which is the Improved Order of the Redmen. And it was dedicated on August 19th, 1899. I did not know that plaque was there, but it is. The interesting thing about the Improved Order of the Redmen is its background, which is they descended from the Sons of Liberty. So we're talking, they were back into the Revolutionary War. Why they're called the Improved Order of the Redmen is they felt they loved America and they loved freedom, and they really liked the Iroquois democracy. So they had picked up the name Improved Order of Redmen. This actually they don't have anything to do with Native Americans themselves, but they had called themselves that. So they erected this one, and of course the Gum Brothers again did the stone base. But this was dedicated 1899, as it says, but 1765 is when they first started the Order of the Redmen. The Knights of Pythias. This was an interesting monument. I've always admired it. It has showed up in several postcards as the Passaconaway Monument, as the elk. So this is on First Ave across from Washington. So the Knights of Pythias was founded in 1864 in Washington, D.C. It was actually through an act of Congress. Justice Rathbone had seen John Banham, who's an Irish poet. He wrote a play called The Legend of Damon and Pythias. It's about friendship, charity, and benevolence. And he had taken that and started a fraternal order with that in mind. So when you see F, C, and B with this crest on stones, it is from that order. It's a secret society, so shh. But this society, I believe, is still going on. There was a Pythian Castle, as it was called. It was in the First Spiritual Society Church on Middlesex Street. That church is still there. It doesn't look anything like it used to before, but it is still there now. So some of the things you'll see is a book with the sword, crossed axes, again, the knight's helmet, and FCB. So if you see that on a gravestone, even without some of the imagery, that's what it means. Now, they several organizations and fraternal organizations had bought lots. These lots were for any of their members that needed a place to be buried in the cemetery. So this is the Elks Monument, probably has to be one of the most famous here. First Ave across from Lincoln. If you look at the black and white picture, there's a little bit of difference. You can see it in the horns, yeah. So again, Gunn Brothers, they did the Elks Rest, the monument. It says number 87 on there. So number 87 was the order, the Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks. That was the Lowell chapter. So it was lodge number 87. So and they started the Benevolent Protective Order of the Elks as an organization in 1868 with just 15 people. By 1888, this lodge had opened up in Lowell, and they were over on Middle Street. But the Elks are still here in Lowell today on Old Ferry Road. So overall, this monument, as I said, 8-foot granite base, and overall it's about 20 feet tall. So this has been a source of postcards and other photography through the years. And it's bronze with a pretty little patina on it. Again, this was for anybody that had joined the Elks Lodge that needed a place to be buried, that didn't have a family plot already. I do want to point out this stone is not from Edson, but if you see this cemetery symbol, this is a symbol for the Freemasons. So we did have a Masonic Lodge in Lowell. So if you see this, the G stands for either God or, so there are several different iterations, but Supreme Being. But this is the symbol. If you see this on, you see it all over Edson Cemetery, the symbol, and that's what it means. Now, interestingly enough, I did find these stones at one point, and they looked a little different to me, especially since that stone that's highlighted there only has initials on it. And knowing what I know, I knew that was a footstone. So why would it be in this row of slate stones that all predate the cemetery? Well, it turns out there was an old cemetery over on Stackpole Street that was condemned in 1846. Why was it condemned? There's several reasons, but they said that it was on the water, so it was flooding, it was unsanitary, it was whatnot. So in November of 1847, they brought all the stones over and put all the remains in a mass grave. They had tried to contact the families first, but if the families were not around, these are the people that were not around to move it to another location or buy a new plot. These are the people that were left behind. So that's what these are. These are burials from an old Belvedere yard. So the Soldiers and Sailors lot, if you look at the Soldiers and Sailors lot today, there's a difference between this old postcard, and the difference is the statue is missing, and it has been missing for many, many years, and no one seems to know where it had gone. It's just been missing as far as anyone can remember. Otherwise, we still have the same areas. So in the Soldiers and Sailors lot, we have, let's see, we have the 2 cannons that were bought from the government, which is from the Civil War era. We have a stack of, I think they're 10-inch cannons. We have a stack of shells that are there, 10 inch as well. So those ones are there. And this was this was put aside in 1902, this lot, and then it was dedicated in 1905. And this was open to any veteran of the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, or Army nurses from those wars. So in the Soldiers and Sailors lot is Sarah N. Ingalls. She was an Army nurse in the Civil War. It says that on her stone. She died in 1893 on June 28th of heart disease. We don't know much about her, only because her pension file was only 5 pages long. They didn't say much about it. We know that she was at Capitol Hospital. She was at Cast Paris Hospital and Point Lookout in Maryland from the summer of 1862 until the winter of 18 1862 until she caught malaria and had to leave. She filed for a pension in 1882, but she was denied. Why? Because they didn't pass the Army Nurse Pension Act until 1892. So in 1892, she applied once again. They got back to her. She applied in October of 1892. They got back to her in October of 1893. Now, she had died that past June, so it was classified as abandoned. She never did get her pension. The GAR did erect the stone for her in the lot. The where you see it upright, that was in 2012. And unfortunately, when I went to find it, it had fallen. So that's going to be in need of repair. The Gregg Monument, it's an interesting monument. The International Order of the Odd Fellows. It sounds like an odd thing. James Gregg, right there, erected by the brothers and sisters of the Independent Order of the Odd Fellows, the Manchester Unity of the United States. And there's this beautiful portrait. The stone overall is an obelisk, which is, you've seen, we talked about using old Greek architecture or Egyptian revival. So using a obelisk was, again, saying that going to classicism and saying, you know, this is remembrance and immortality. The brothers and sisters of the Independent Order of the Odd Fellows, it sounds strange, but it goes back to medieval guilds. And you needed guilds to protect yourself. It was an early form of social welfare. If you weren't part of a guild, you had an issue. So there were master guilds, but then there were these people who didn't quite fit in to these guilds. So they banded together and called themselves the Odd Fellows. Their symbol is friendship, love, and truth. It's interlecting 3 rings. You can see that. And so this stone here, he was the secretary of the Independent Order of the Odd Fellows here in Lowell. And that really is a great portrait of him on there. The Galloway Monument. Sometimes you walk through a cemetery and you just wonder what happened. When you read this stone, when you see that William, Eliza, Robert had all passed away in the same time, and then Emily had passed away a year later, something had happened. And also something had happened to that stone, which is kind of falling off its base. So this is 2nd Ave near Washington. So what happened to the Galloways? Well, they were part of the Riverside Park explosion of 1903. What had happened is at the time, that area, which is now South Lowell, was part of Tewksbury. And the U.S. Cartridge Company was using that area to store ammunition and powder, mostly powder, to make ammunition. So when Lowell started stretching out and they needed space, they started developing that. And a wave of immigrants had come to settle in downtown Lowell. So the workers that were a little more established were moving out. And so the workers, the English workers and the French Canadian workers had spread out a bit, and they bought houses and set up a community, all right around this Cartridge Company explosion powder house. So on July 29th, 1903, something happened. And they went to clean something, used the wrong chemicals, and it exploded. 22 dead, 77 injured. The Galloway family were part of the ones that died. Emily died actually in 1904 from her injuries from the original July incident. That area was so rural, Tewksbury didn't even have a fire warden or anyone. They were just they weren't even really aware what was going on in the area. So when the explosion happened, it was Lowell who came to its aid. And when they came and they brought people to the Corporation Hospital and the militia came to secure the site, that's pretty much what happened. In this area, as I said, was South Lowell. This is 40 minutes after the explosion. The survivor of the Galloway family, William Jr., he did survive only because he was swimming in this area by the arched bridge and got thrown into the water. Unfortunately, his friends he was playing with, those boys did not. They're buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery. But since he survived, he went back home with family to England, and they erected the stone. They just didn't know his sister's date of birth, which is more around 1894, so they had got that wrong. But they erected the stone for the family. So the Edson family lot. So we know about Theodore Edson. We know he came and was passed in 1824 and was Reverend of the St. Anne's Church in downtown Lowell, the church. And this is his lot. He wanted to be buried here. He felt to be among his people. So that flat cross in the ground with the lot, his name is inscribed around here with his wife and his daughter. So that is the Edson family lot. I think it kind of says a lot about him. And also the cross that you see that says Theodore Edson Orphanage Lot. The orphanage lot had a lot there as well in Edson Cemetery, so that's nearby. So the Edson family was, that's where they're buried. The Richardsman Monument. This is interesting because there are stones that look quite simple, but they have a fantastic story behind them, as some of them do. Charles Henry Richardson. So he died in 1913. He was known as Henry. He was born in Northfield. He was one of the youngest of 8 children. So he was born in 1843. What's interesting is he and his brother Luther both joined the Union Army and fought, but his sister Eunice's husband, who was from the South, decided to join the Confederate Army. So the 2 brothers had gone. Luther passed away. Henry survived. Eunice's husband, their sister Eunice's husband, passed away, William Stone, from disease in 1863. And she was left poor, widowed, with children to take care of. Now, she had lived in Dracut. She was around her family, but she was working as a laundress and she was very poor. What she did was quite astounding at the time. She met a colored, he was considered colored, ship captain named Smiley Conley, and fell in love with him and decided to marry him, despite being a social outcast for that. She decided to move to go down to the Cayman Islands with him. That's where he's from. Henry and his sister had written back and forth so many times. The family had so many letters saved. And it's quite fascinating because these letters actually went into the book, The Sea Captain's Wife. So Martha Hodes found these letters and had used them as the basis of the story. So this is a biography about Eunice Richardson Stone. And if Henry had not kept all those letters, then they wouldn't have known her story and how she went on. Now, Henry had gone on to be overseer of the Lawrence Mills in the 1870s. And by 1888, he was an agent for the Appleton Mills. So it's his sister's story that became the Sea Captain's Wife. And I think that's pretty fascinating. How can I do a tour of Edson Cemetery without talking about the most famous of the people buried here, and that is Jack Kerouac. So he's located, his stone, Lincoln Ave, between 7th and 8th Ave. He died in 1969, and he had this flat stone for many, many years. People would come and leave trinkets, shots. They'd leave flip-flops and smokes and whatever they wanted to leave for him. His stone is a little colored because people would leave candles and other things that would stain his stone. But it's pretty interesting to see the types of things people would come and leave because people came specifically to see him. And his new stone was erected. This is his family's lot, his wife's family's lot. So that's Jack Kerouac. That's the new one. So that's his new gravestone that they have just put up a couple of years ago. So Maud Mountford on Logan Ave, near the corner of Fifth Ave, again, simple stone. She's listed there, died in 1957. She was the very first woman superintendent of cemeteries in New England, especially Lowell, New England, and possibly the United States. She was head clerk of the cemeteries of Lowell when her boss, the superintendent, had to take a leave of absence. So she had filled in for some time before he resigned, and she went into the position, which was completely new to have a woman in that position. But the whole thing was that she oversaw 30 men in 5 different cemeteries. So that's pretty impressive. Miss Sarah Mann, between 6th and 7th Ave. This is another stone that I came across and just thought it was interesting. They estimated her date of birth around 1843, being a slave in Virginia. They don't have adequate records. This is the Calvary Baptist Church lot that she was buried in, and they erected the stone for her. And it says, born in slavery, lived and died in the freedom of her divine master's service. I want to talk about the white bronze. It's not really bronze. That's just a marketing ploy. It's actually a lot of mixed metals. They're actually also called zinkies because they're mostly zinc. So they are metal. They're quite stunning and they keep their shape. They all have the same thing. Some are, quite elaborate with some have urns, some are just smaller. But what they have in common is the plates that the information is written on is tied in by screws. So they're screwed in. So these were popular between the 1870s and maybe about 1912 or so. But the problem is you'll often see these damaged because people seem to think that there was a myth going around that people would hide bootleg things inside because they're hollow. So people would go and start prying off the things to see if anything was hidden inside, which most of the time wasn't. There's a joke going around in the cemetery, people who enjoy cemeteries about zinkies. And they said, you could tell when one of the salespeople came through town because all of a sudden a whole bunch of zinks went up at once. And it's no different in Edson. There's a lot of different zinks walking through the cemetery. Well, last but not least, Edson Chapel. This is on Washington Ave. It's built in 1883. Again, Louis Gum did the stonework. The architect was Dr. Leroy J. Charrington, who was an interesting fellow, and that's his ad there. So he had a place here in Mass, in Lowell, and then one in Worcester. So he was called a hygiene physician. So he believed that all natural raw diets of fruits and berries and things like that. He was very against vaccinations and very against irradiated food. So an interesting person. One thing I didn't talk about here, which you see in most cemeteries, is a receiving tomb. There was a receiving tomb here in Edson Cemetery. It was at the corner of Washington and 4th Ave. But because with the advent, it used to be people digging by hand, you would have to store the body somewhere in the winter. With the advent of machinery that was able to dig, they weren't needed anymore. And the space was actually needed to sell more lots. So they took that down in order to have more saleable lots. And this is the sleeping child. There's actually one of these in Lowell Cemetery too. When you see child stones, they're often quite beautiful. This one here is just a resting child. You often see with children, you'll see lambs, carved lambs, as it also, and you'll see an unmade bed. You'll see empty boots and empty shoes. I think that goes with that story, the very short, sad story, which is shoes for sale, baby's boots never worn. So it's that thought that these children died young. It's quite lovely. And so going through these, you can see there's many different styles, and that's in that you can see some slates. You'll see some marble. You'll see here, I didn't see a name on this one, but sometimes names are carved on the bottom. But these are quite lovely. So with that, I do want to say, if you have any questions, if you are interested in cemeteries at all, I'm going to give you the information for the Association for Gravestone Studies. I would ask that you, if you're going to go to a cemetery and do touch the stones or in any way clean them or anything, please do the research to make sure you're not harming them further. And so I would contact them. They have a lot of great people that can talk you through it and tell you the right way to do things if you have permission to touch the stones in the first place. So we can stop there. If we have any questions, we'll leave it here on the child. Let me, okay. Go back. So,
So we have a question from Marie. What is the stone's cost?
Which stone? In general, or?
Marie, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm interested in what they cost. I mean, you've got a whole range of materials, whole range of carving, or the elaborateness of some and the simpleness of others.
I mean, the of course, the Sawyer Monument would be with the elaborate carving would be much more. When we say marble, I have to say, not many people are importing marble from Carrara. I mean, the Carrara marble that you see, like the Air Lion being made of, this marble here is a much lower quality, unfortunately. And that's a good question because there were a couple of stones, and I honestly can't tell you off the top of my head exactly how much they cost. So I can't answer that question for you. I'm sorry. I know that marble became more popular than slate, but marble, I'm trying to think of marble, the lower quality marble, of course, didn't cost as much. I can't off the top of my head, and I'm sorry, give you a price right this moment.
I was just thinking comparatively, but what about granite? I mean, not the cost, but when did granite become the more popular?
I'm going to say around 1900 is when they had the machinery. Granite was such a hard stone until it was not hand carvable, until they actually had the technology to go ahead and start using mnemonic drills and whatnot. That's really like the Arnold, the Palmer Monument, that would not have been able to be done if they didn't have the tools to do it. So that's 1915. So I'd say around 1900 is when things started to change and they started using granite more. It's one thing to use it for a base, but to actually carve things into it is much different.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question. This a cemetery like the Hunt and Clark that is abandoned, who actually owns that then? The city of Lowell?
No. What happened was back in the 1600s, it was a family. It's the same thing with the clay pit. The clay pit was the Coburn family, the Coburn Pierce family. The Hunt Clark family was exactly the same. What happened is there was a movement to get it adopted by the Lowell Cemetery, but Dr. Clark passed away before that could happen. If you're going by, see, they didn't think this way back in the 17 and 1800s. This was a family graveyard. They expected people to stay on the farm. They never thought about mobility and people moving out. What happens is, legal wise, unless there's a deed that says it's left to a specific town, like the Hildreth Cemetery had a deed saying it was left to the inhabitants of Dracut. That's why Dracut still takes care of it. In the absence of one of those deeds, it becomes whoever officially owned the land last. For the Hunt Clarks, that would be the Hunt family. That actually moved out by 1900. They had sold the property. But if you look at the surrounding property, all the boundary lines are around the cemetery. So it was never sold. So officially, legally, it still belongs to the family. But it's classified as abandoned.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kim, this is a great presentation, but I just have one small correction. The chapel wasn't designed by Leroy, but it was designed by his brother Frank. And the Charringtons are a really fascinating story. They're both from Boston. Frank goes first and apprentices to an architect by the name of Tourtelay in Worcester. In the 1870s, he arrives in Lowell first to design the First Universalist Church. He's very busy, and he brings his kind of ne'er-do-well brother Leroy up to help him. And they have a firm for a short while, and then they have a very public breakup of the firm. So Leroy took the Boston and Maine terminal, and Frank did many other things. But Frank was the actual architect.
Frank was the actual architect.
Yeah,
that's interesting because Leroy's name kept coming up. It's probably because he was more infamous.
Yes, he was. And then he went into his physical culture business, and he was totally distracted by that. And then and became some kind of a questionable physician. But here's another little thing that I stumbled across yesterday, and I'll share with folks. For a long time, I've been obsessed with trying to find out who the architect was of the Hoyt and Shed houses. And happening in the midst of research, you always find something else. Yeah. This surprised me, but I found an obituary for Frank Charrington that attributes the Hoyt and Shed houses to him.
Really?
Yeah, so that was a great surprise. But I'd speculated on that when I was researching on Charrington before, because Charrington was the architect of the new First Universalist Church on Hurd Street, and Freeman Shed was on the building committee, so they had lots of opportunity for interaction. It doesn't mean that another architect might have been involved, and Charrington might only have been the supervising architect, but this is the closest I've come to an actual assignment. Which is interesting.
Yeah. So thank you for that correction. I give Frank his credit where it's due.
Yeah, poor Frank.
Rather than Leroy.
It was the
Leave
last
me
thing that Frank did before he left Lowell to go back to Boston.
So, oh, and you know what? I always wondered who the architect was for the Hoyt shed. So that's very interesting. So thank you
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah, obviously Charrington must have done more residential work around the area. We just don't know what it is. Houses tend not to get attributed. I've been lucky to find some attributions for a lot of them.
So, actually, it's interesting. I should bring up the Historical Society does have the working notebooks of Edwin Clark, the architect, and all the work that he did. So you might be interested in that in the future.
Yeah, he's a very interesting character too.
Were there any other questions or thoughts and I'm going to suggest really, if you haven't done the tour for Lowell Cemetery, definitely do it. But hopefully one day I can actually get you in. Well, you can do this yourself to go in and see them, but someday actually give a tour in the cemetery. I think Edson doesn't get enough credit sometimes for being the type of cemetery it is. So any other thoughts or questions or?
Very interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Can you give me back the power so I can stop